Again, I am Bill Gibbs. I'll be the host for the session today, and it is a true pleasure to see all of you join us today. Now, we're going to have an interesting session today with Dr. Rick Hansen. I do want to mention for those of you that thought you might be joining Dr. Darren Dillow today and had not gotten the word, Dr. Dillow was unavoidably called on a business trip to Brazil. And he was not sure that on this day, as he was traveling, that he would have internet capabilities. So he asked to push the session to next month. And so I'll talk about that more later. But in the meanwhile, Dr. Rick Hansen very generously consented to join us for today. And I think you'll enjoy the presentation. It's called A Simple Method of Detecting Common Encryption Vulnerability. And having been the victim of a Zoom bombing myself, where some teenager or junior high kid jumped into the middle of my work session and began drawing not so friendly symbols on, kind of graphic symbols on the screen. I learned a lot from that lesson. It wasn't an encryption problem, but it certainly was an aggravating problem. He had borrowed his mother's URL and should have been at school or doing his schoolwork, and instead was invading my Zoom session. But today, Dr. Hansen will talk about a much more serious problem, which is an encryption problem. I think you'll enjoy that. Let me talk a little bit about the agenda that we'll be following today. First, I'm going to give just a little bit about Capital. We always have a handful of people who are not that familiar with our organization. Then session pointers. I'll introduce the presenter. We'll have the presentation, which is the bulk of the webinar, of course. Dr. Hansen and I discussed just before everyone joined us that he'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. We'll try to tackle as many of those as we can. Then we'll talk about our upcoming webinar with Dr. Dillow next month and how to get a copy of the recording, the slides, and a certificate of attendance if you wish one. Again, a lot of you, I know that, for example, Dr. Vergers is on our faculty, so he knows a great deal about our institution, but every once in a while we'll encounter somebody who does not know a great deal about us. So forgive me for if this is old stuff for you and might not be for everyone. Capital in 1927 was founded, and that means that in 2027, in just a few years, we're going to be celebrating our 100th anniversary. An amazing span of time and an amazing technological capacity that we have developed over the years. We're one of the only private universities in Maryland, and actually almost one of the few in the entire country that is specifically dedicated to STEM, to engineering, cyber, computer sciences, and the management of technology. We are nonprofit, private, and accredited. Each of these are potent words. I won't go into much of a detail about those, but I do want to mention about accredited. Often we have people joining us from around the world, and they're not that familiar with American accreditation. In the United States, the top level of accreditation that you can receive is actually regional accreditation. You might think it would be national, but it's not. It's regional. And we have that top level of accreditation through the Middle States Commission on Higher Education. We're also approved by the state of Maryland to offer a wide variety of degrees, all the way from the 2-year or associate degrees right up to all of our doctoral degrees. And by the way, at the very end of the presentation, I'm going to put in a word about more information about joining a session about our doctoral and master's degrees. Here are some session pointers, and we're almost ready to introduce the speaker and get right into it. We'll answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation, but at any point you can type them into the text chat. That is the methodology that we'll be using today for you to ask your questions. We'll monitor the questions, and at the end of the presentation, come back to each one and answer them. We'll answer just as many questions as we can within the hour that we have together. Microphones and webcams are not being activated for our participants today, so the only way you can communicate with us is via the text chat. We'll be sending a link to the recording as well as to the slides to every registrant on our, and it will also be available on our webinar's webpage. And for those that would like one, we'll offer a participation or attendance certificate for one CEU. Anyway, with that, let's get right into where we're to the presentation, which is the heart of why we're here today. A simple method of detecting a common encryption vulnerability. Let me introduce our presenter. Many of you know him already and probably have had a class or two with him, Dr. Richard Rick Hansen. I'm going to let Dr. Hansen fully introduce himself on his slides, but here are just a few highlights. He is a professor of practice in cybersecurity here at Capital, as well as the lead faculty member for astronautical engineering and unmanned and autonomous systems. He also mentors and supports student projects in the cyber program. He works with the cybersecurity competition team, which is called Signal 9, and the students in the astronautical engineering program. He holds both a BS and a PhD from Capital and a master's degree from Johns Hopkins University. He's a frequent speaker at DEFCON and Gray Hat conferences, a military veteran, and in his spare time, and I've thought about this, I really don't know when he has spare time, but in his spare time, he is CEO of a cybersecurity and research firm, a very busy guy. And so I'm so grateful that Dr. Rick Hansen has consented to share some of his busy days with us right now. And with that, I'm going to give him control of the session. So let us make that switch over, and then he will begin his presentation. Over to you, Dr. Hansen.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. Thank you. That's great. Hello, everyone. We're going to go through a talk. It may introduce some new principles for you. I'm hoping that you'll enjoy it, and hopefully we can go through a few things together. Many people look at encryption as kind of magic. It's something you ask for, it shows up, and how do you really know how it works? We're going to take a little bit of a look under the hood and find out how tools you've probably used every day to send messages to people could actually be used to look at an encrypted file and tell whether it was of at least one indicator that it was properly encrypted. And thanks to the great introduction, we already told a lot about me. I'm at Capital, at Capital, we focus on the engineering, computer science, cyber related disciplines, and certainly you're all up to speed on that. We'll be talking more about that later. And we're going to talk about why this is of interest to you, even if you don't ever use the technique, why you should be at least aware that it's there, and how someone who did have the skills with it would be able to perhaps help you determine if it's being done properly in places you care about. With Zoom, it was interesting, a huge amount of video, both business, government, and a lot of people's private lives were disrupted because people they didn't know had the ability in some cases to look at what was being shared, and in other cases actually were able to join in. There was no one thing. We could spend a week on Zoom, all the things that could have been done better. In this case, I looked at one thing, which was encryption, because that people have a lot of difficulty sometimes wrapping their head around it. We're going to try and make that simpler for you. And your average professionals often don't know how to determine whether they're getting a good quality product or not. So we did another talk called a $49 cybersecurity laboratory here at Capital. We like to look at straightforward solutions. Sometimes you use something with an existing technology that'll do a job that people thought they'd need something more expensive. And it's a lot of fun. And there's a link below from citizenlab.canada, and I believe we'll get the slides later. AES-256 is a high-end encryption. 256 means the key is 32 bytes or 256 zeros and ones long. Well, they didn't. They claimed end-to-end encryption, which means when you send your data to Zoom, you've got your own key, and when I send mine, I've got another key. and so on and so on for everyone else. Well, they didn't. They used one key for everyone, so any one person could compromise everybody else's communications. They did use AES-128, which is still good encryption. They used a vulnerable mode that made it, I won't say trivial, but much easier to go ahead and break for someone who had the skills. And it was interesting because by using cheaper encryption, you save some money on server time and things like that. But the software is also developed by 700 employees in China, which may or may not be an issue depending on how you look at things. But when you add everything together, it was curious. And we'll go into a little bit more about the pictures below, but it was meant for when you want to send one small piece of data to people and you can detect it. There's a concept called entropy, which is how much randomness there is in a message. Unfortunately, the amount of randomness in the Zoom transmissions was rather low. And as you can see underneath on the far right is an example where you've got something that's very random, and you can't any mode other than the electronic codebook mode we'll discuss. You really can't determine anything, even though and we'll get a better picture of this in a minute. The original picture of this, you can get a good idea of what's going on, and it's a shame that they selected that mode, and it's a shame that more people weren't made not knowledgeable about what it really meant. And what this simply means when let's say you have a letter, a word such as Fred, and it all fits into one little piece of ciphertext. That means every time Fred sent out, depending on the key, it'll be a unique number. For example, if you used one key, Fred might be a pattern, 5 zeros followed by 5 ones followed by 3 zeros. And if you change the key, it would have a different pattern, but that pattern would always be unique to the word Fred. And that's unfortunately the situation with a lot of textual data and imagery data too. There are other modes, and it's very curious as to why they implemented this mode and then it's not that much more trouble to implement the others. Yeah. What you get in the output is you don't really get, if you had the color, if this is with no processing, this is if you just took it. And this is from both Wikipedia and another fine article. You can see that you can't see the finer details of our friend Tux the penguin. The colors are wrong in places, but you can see the human eye is very good at picking up patterns. We see that where things change. That's part of being a carbon-based life form. And wow, you can get if you saw a couple people in a room or a conference room, you'd be able to tell a lot about the space, a lot about the people. I'm gonna go back just one so we can go ahead and see where you were. You were here, and this is not a faithful reproduction, but this is with very low level of skills. You'd be able to pull this out based on the technology they're using, which you can imagine that made a lot of people not that happy. And the reason is all the white gets encoded to a different number, which gives a different color, but still the tie gets encoded to the different numbers. The feet have a couple of different colors on them, so you'll see a bit of mixture around the feet. I think all of us would have a fairly easy time telling, wow, and we'd have difficulty believing that you were able to pull that out of an encrypted message. Now, before we get started about encryption algorithms, I'll bring a small example over which almost everybody can do. Almost everybody could do at home. If you have a message that 4 zeros and 4 ones, let's say, oh, I'm going to change all the zeros to ones. That, like the ECB, doesn't help you a whole lot. It goes ahead and people just look at it, they would just do the same thing you did, just change the ones to zeros, the zeros to ones. However, if you this is called confusion. It's where you use a different symbol. If you used instead of a 0, you've got a 1. Instead of an A, you've got an E or a Z. If you do there's one thing called diffusion where you move them around. And let's go a little bit more with the confusion part though. If we say just every other time, so this is a 0, we change it to a 1. We don't change this 0. We leave this 0 as a 0. We change this 0 to a 1. We change this 0. We don't change it because it's the next one. We skip the next one, whatever this is, we change the opposite. That's now a 0. We leave this one alone. And so on down the line, what you get is you start just with a simple rule like that. You can go in, you can change data so that it looks very different from the beginning with a very simple rule. And we're going to be talking about encryption, but this is what modern encryption does for you. It changes the symbol you're using, a 0 or a 1 or whatever characters you're using, and also changes the location. In addition to this, you would take the bits and move them around to different places. So when we talk about encryption, we're talking about changing some bits and moving it from 1 to 0 and 0 to 1, and moving everything around so that if you look at something that's probably not where it started out. When you see this in your banking, they say they use MOOPs, military grade encryption, which they like to say things like that. They usually mean they use AES. And AES is used mainly in the civilian world, but they do have versions which are authorized for very sensitive things. And this means this handles 16 characters, for the key is 16 characters long. And the other is 256 characters long. They're both fine if whoever's trying to read your mail doesn't have a quantum computer. There's a very, as long as you keep your key safe, because it's this type of key called a symmetric algorithm, which means the sender and receiver use the same key. Encrypts your message, sends it back and forth, and as long as you keep your key safe, and when you go to Google, if you see a little lock on a web browser, you'll see a little lock next to the website name. That means they use a very, very powerful type of encryption to deliver the same encryption key to both of you and the other person. So now you each have you and Google have the same key, you and whoever else you're talking to have the same key. So just one key is type is 16 bytes, the other is 32. The 32 bytes is stronger. And they both take 16 characters at a time. Now there are much stronger methods, which you're going to have we don't really have to know how they work. You just have to know that they are much, much stronger. And when we go through this, we'll talk about why ECB is weak, how you can test for it, and why these are strong. We talk about transformation, and the fourth line down is that we transform something from something you can read, your plain text, into something you can't read, which is your ciphertext. And that's what you'd hope for. You'd hope that you'd be able to take a message that means something to you, that you want your confidentiality. As cybersecurity professionals, we're obsessed with confidentiality, making sure that things are private, integrity, making sure that what you sent is what gets there, and availability, that when you pick up the phone that you can actually send a message to someone. So just think about that for a second. How many of our lives, if we didn't have confidentiality and integrity, how our lives would change if encryption didn't prevent someone from adding or subtracting or changing one word to a text message. Changing a word in several text messages could certainly change a lot of relationships. So that's one reason why we go through making sure that has something called a measure of disorder. It looks chaotic. It means that when you look at the bits in a ciphertext, there's no pattern. Like you don't see 1010. You don't see lots of patterns in there that would give you to a key how it was moving all the bits around. And not going to go through it, but how do these bits work around? They take parts of the key, and this is called XOR symbol, but the big deal is they move them. They move them across to several different parts of the key you put out, and they combine them in different ways through something that's so fiendishly complex that it's very straightforward to make it go from top to bottom, but from bottom to top would take all the computing power that exists in the earth many, many, many years to go ahead and reverse one of these. And that if you want to do more research, it's called an S box. And if just as a note, if you go looking at the S box, you can think, oh, I know how to write software for that. Or if you find software for an S box and you think, hey, I can make this work. I know how to, I'd like to play with this. Then we'd love to talk to you. Not only do we have courses which you would enjoy, but there are some lots of customers in the area who would love to put you to work. So if you have anyone in your family who's mathematically gifted and they may not have had formal training, but they can seem to be able to have an unreal ability to solve puzzles, have an unreal ability to see relationships, please feel free to take this presentation, show some of the terms to them, because we work very hard to find people who can do things like this. And if you've got someone, we can either here or at other places can provide them with resources where they could grow this very, very rare ability and do wonderful things for humanity with it. Now, even if you don't speak, there's something called hex, which is a code for different words. You can look in the screen. There's these 3 lines after the first part, which is just the address in the file. You'll see that this line has all the same characters on it. This line this is hex, which uses 0 through 9 and A through F to show numbers. It's a quick way of a shorthand. It's a lot easier to look at things here than putting everything in binary. And you look, it's the same one. This is where I took the letter A. I filled a file with nothing but the letter A. I ran it through ECB mode, just like our friends at Zoom did, except I used a stronger encryption, the AES-256. And there you see all this data came out exactly the same. The same file over and over and over again. And this is what was happening in Zoom. If you send a blank screen, every so often you'll send a blank screen or a black screen or a white screen. That will show people using ECB, and it may give them some additional clues they need to break through the cryptography. Now there are other ones, and what the other ones do is they actually require a second key. It's called initialization vector or a similar name, which works with the first one so that you could encrypt the same thing every time, the same letter, all A's, but every time it gets encrypted, it looks different. And we'll go through here again. I'm going to go back to the slide before. We'll see what it was. See, it starts DC, there, it starts there. But then from the second word on, everything changes. This is the third word. It starts out with the same one we had before because it's AES. The first block's going to be the same. At least the one we use, cipher blockchain. Some of the others even change the first block. But let's go back here to CC again. 95 DC, just remember that, and 8720, we go to the next one. As you can see, the first block is the same, but after that, every successive one gets modified. So this is the same file, all A's, but every time it prints it out, it changes it for you. And all you have to know is the other modes provide additional safety that you don't get from the ECB. And it makes one wonder why they chose it. Sometimes people just don't know, by the way, trying to read bad intent. And I've talked to people who you would think would know, and they don't really know what's going on. So if you come out of this, up now, if you can see, oh, we're moving zeros and ones around. If we use ECB, I'll leave clues in the file that can help people break it. And if I use cipher blockchain or output feedback, any of the other modes, it's much more difficult to use. Then that's great. That's a very good management level overview of encryption. Now, if you want to detect it, that's the other side. Looking through all the binary coming out of your system, you can there are tools which we'll talk about later, which you can capture with very straightforwardly. There's the traditional method rates it from 0, which means, oh, that's all A's or it's all zeros or all ones. That means when you look at bits, it's a 100% prediction that if you look at this bit, you can know what the next bit is going to be. And if you had A, B, C, things like A, B, C and stuff, they're 0.0 something or 0.1. However, if you get up into the 7.7 and above, roughly, this means is when I see a bit, 8 means if I see a bit here, I have absolutely no idea what's going to come next. And a lot of times you look at this as a byte. So if I've got all A's or all zeros, which is a null, or all ones, this says, oh, I know exactly what's coming next. In this case, I say an 8 means I have absolutely no idea what comes next. And typically anything in the mid 7s up is so unpredictable that it's a pretty good cipher. But if I go to people and I'm going to talk about these tools, Cryptool and Int, you have to know something about theory for this, and it's not very instinctive. In effect, you're looking at a phenomenon. You're taking the word of the tool that this is a safe, or this is not safe, or it's marginal. So we looked at this and thought, boy, is it possible to go ahead and come up with a means of judging encryption? And so we thought about patterns, and I started looking around for other things that worked on patterns. And when I say file-based, these are utilities you and I use to send things in email. Zip is a common one. There's bzip and there's RAR, and there's a number of them. I chose Zip because I compared it to the others, and Zip gave the best performance compression. There's a paper coming out with all these details. There's a GitHub reference, which you'll see at the end of this. So if you want more details, I've certainly got it for you. File-based compression, it detects repeated patterns. It has a little index that says, put this pattern here in the message when it rebuilds it. So if you've got something copied over and over and over, then it's very efficient about compressing it, because it just says, hey, take this byte or this series of bytes and repeat them however many 100 or 1,000 times you need to. And they're free. They're included most everywhere. And I did it with relatively small files. Small files, when there's a very small difference, it's often difficult to detect. But that also means that it's something that you can, it's a small file, you can go ahead and create it with Notepad if you're in Windows, VI, or hopefully a better editor for your Unix aficionado. On the Mac, you've got a number of tools there too. And I test this approach. This is something you can do at home or at work when we get finished. If you can put something in, encrypt it, and my resource out on GitHub if you look at some of the script files there, you can see that all the tools are free. You can download them for Windows and Linux. I tested it with both the what I'll call the less capable cipher mode and the more capable, for 3 different ciphers. And one is AS256, which is a common one and used throughout the world. It's DS and SEED. And you've probably heard of the first two. This one, I was looking for something that was very different, had a whole different structure, had a different set of people building it, because I want to make sure that what I find true isn't just true for the methodology we use in America to go ahead and build things. It was a universal means of detection of issues. And I've got some things in bold, and you can read the slide as well as I can. When something's in ECB, we use the most capable cipher in ECB, squeezes it down pretty well. We go to the other mode, it actually gets bigger, and the reason is, since it can't compress it, it needs a few extra bytes to put the information in that says, hey, I can't compress this. It's also got to store the file name, the file names in there. that, you know, when you uncompress something, it needs to know what the file name is going to be. So it actually takes up more room. And you'll find that here also with the other, what I call the good mode, output feedback. You start out with 2560, you compressed it, oh gosh, it got bigger. Well, that's a pretty good indication that the file is so random, or if it's not random, it's a type of randomness that can't be picked up by zip. One of the earliest modes was DES, and actually using this technique, we found out that with the no-cost tool that comes with most Linuxes, that there are problems with AES. If you have an all 0 or all 1 key, it causes it problems. This one implementation of this one version allowed us, no matter which implementation of AES you used, if you used all zeros or all ones for a key, it had compressibility, which meant there was a flaw with the cryptography somewhere. So this is not a thorough, it's not something that's a professional level exam by any of it, stretched imagination, but it certainly is something that if you do find a problem with it, it's a key that you do need to look for more. So once again, it starts 2568 bytes, it drops down to 79. And that's the electronic codebook mode. Once again, a file full of all A's, but it could have been all zeros, all ones. And it turned them into something very, very small. And once again, we use the cipher blockchaining, a more complex mode. And wow, it got bigger. And same thing for this with output feedback. Once again, it gets bigger. And so we go outside of the US, seeing what happens with other tools. Once again, ECB, never a good idea. And oh my, but when you change the other mode, you could go ahead and do something. The implementation I had didn't have this mode. It doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means the people implemented on the free platform haven't gotten that part of it put in yet. So once again, the idea is if you ever compress a file and that's encrypted and it gets smaller, it means one of two things. You included things like when you send emails and when you send packets, you have headers, and that header information does have some regularity, some empty space, some structure that can be compressed. Or it means that there's a possibility of a problem with compression. And I use this before I use more advanced tools. Now I use this for reviewing communications and encryption issues. If you get a large corpus of data from a megabyte to get into the gigabytes, and there's a tool we'll show later which will take all the other network information off and leave you with just the network data. If you take it in small hunks, you can go ahead megabytes to gigabytes. You can see if there are issues. Sometimes you can see people if they're developing a new driver and they've got a new version of the algorithm, you may find a problem they didn't know existed. The professional world uses numbers from zero to 8. And of course, we're using compression percentage. And what you find is this is how much it compresses related to the different values of entropy. We did some experiments where we would put random numbers in and repeating over and over again, so there was some compressibility. And we were able to come out with the fact that the file-based compression using pkzip provides something that's directly related to the numbers for entropy. You can see this is the dashed line is how much smaller something gets when you compress it. It goes down to 1% of its size, to 10% of its size, 100% of its size. And here's the relation to the actual measurement, formal measurement from 0 to 8. So it tracks pretty well. We call this an inverse logarithmic relationship. And we fix that a little bit by, instead of showing by getting them to go back and forth, we use the percentage of shrinkage as opposed to the percentage compressed. And we did a few things. We got the things to line up well. If you have any questions, if you'd like to do this yourself, please send me an email. Everything's out on GitHub, and was working very late at night on it a lot. So hopefully you can make some improvements on it. There's a free tool. If you want to learn more about cybersecurity, we're always having talks. It's something called Cyber Saturday up in our cyber lab. We can show you how you can go ahead, sit at home, capture data on your home network, store it to a file, and then you can use tools like this to look at the data. Wireshark runs in Windows and it runs in Linux. It's a wonderful means of you going through, learning about networks. If you know how to use it, it takes the payload. It's instead of, it's like seeing a truck going by in the highway and being able just to take the semi-trailer off the back and look at what's inside there. And then you can compare, well, I compressed it. Did I get more than like 0.5% or 1%? And then there's either some regularities, somebody's putting some unencrypted data in there, or there's an issue. Sometimes it can be they've repeated packets, and that'll happen as well. But when you go look at the data, you'll figure it out pretty quickly. And when I say to people, capture some data, zip it and see if it gets smaller. A lot of people like that because they use zip. You do a right mouse click in Windows on the Mac. A lot of Linuxes, you have the option of compressing something right there with zip. And for video, what I believe is going to happen, if you are interested, put a cloth over your dark cloth over your, or a couple paper bags over your camera, and then that should give you a uniform value coming out of it. And your camera does compress things when it sends it, but in some cases you find it even with compression, there's still enough regularity in there you can recover things. So this is one area where you might be able to do some research. There's a talk from some place called RVASec called Mobile Internet Love, and they found that in the clear to save on processing power, when you look on some of the dating apps, says this person is 0.3 miles from you, this person's 2 miles away. Actually, it knows that you're 2.0073 miles away. And you could look at, they have the processing and the truncating of the distance done in the app to save money. Well, it's very possible that your data, which you believe is encrypted going out, may not be encrypted out of some of these applications. So that's an area I'm thinking of having some students work with. If any of you'd like to be involved, like to play with this, I'd be glad to give you some suggestions on how you can do it. We might find something uncomfortable, or you might find something that's really cool depending on your point of view. Now, we did notice, just to let you know, that in some cases you can, using compression, we found some indicators you might be able to tell which cipher is in use. And I need to do more work, and that'll probably happen in the summer or the fall. If you're interested in that, please let us know. And once again, this is the question we'd be asking. And if you're really interested, we'd be glad to point you to a number of topics. And well, thank you, Greemy. I appreciate it. Now, out here in GitHub, you'll see lots of scripts. Instead of typing things to test this out, I've got the source files I created. I've got all sorts of shell scripts. So you pretty much sit back and you run it. It should run on the same version of Linux. Also with Windows, you can download. They've got a shell, bash shell, which you can download for Windows. You can run there. And thank you. I've talked enough. Hopefully you found it useful, and I'd love to hear any questions you have, because this is kind of cool stuff. If you told me that I could go ahead. Oh, thank you, Arthur. That's a good point. Thank you, Arthur. Yeah, I had no idea you could use a very simple tool like PKZip, look at some data and get useful information from it. And there are a couple people made a cheeseburger because of that. So, Mr. Gibbs, thank you. That's my section.
Right. You know, Dr. Hansen, you scared me on that dating app. Not that I'm dating. I've been married 47 years and I'm not planning on finding a new wife. But I was just thinking how many thousands, perhaps millions of people have used dating apps and might be exposing themselves to some really dangerous players. It never occurred to me. Now, let's open the floor to questions, and you can comment on that as well. But let's open the floor to questions via text chat. They're starting to come in. What I'll do is I'll read them back to Dr. Hansen, and so that everybody hears what the question is, and then we'll go from there. So we'll start with the question from Elizabeth. What would be a good use for ECB, since it seems it is not very secure? Are there good uses? That's probably a better question. Are there any good uses for it?
Yes, if you're sending information that's very short, for example, if you sent the temperature from a weather station, or maybe somebody's heartbeat, because it's very small and would fit well within that 1 byte, that might be a good use. Places, but then since you may be saying the same value over and over again, you change your key every so often, it's really for something that healthy is probably not. For other things, we expect a wide range of numbers, and there's some cases where people count things, and where they they bring a number of figures together and get a summary of it. It has its usefulnesses, but because of the issues with it, there's something called SAES. If you Google SAES, simplified AES, there's research. It actually takes a lot less processing power for simplified AES. So ECB, at one point, it has a couple of very small areas. It's useful. It's also useful because you only send 1 key over. You don't need to send an initialization vector. So if you've got something where you send a number of, you send numbers that change, or commands, or data that has a lot of variety to it, and it fits within a 32 bytes, 32 characters, then yes, it can be used there. If you're going to be using over a long period of time, cryptanalysts, cryptologists are very patient. They gather data for years looking for holes and things. So that's a place where it wouldn't be. So that's something like your weather station or your smartwatch. People would see the same value all the time. They wouldn't know if that meant 70 beats a minute, 50 beats a minute, or 100. So for something small like that, that would probably be a good use for it, because it wouldn't use as much power and it'd be simpler.
Thank you. That's an excellent answer. Peter Land asks a very insightful question. How is 5G impacted by this type of encryption?
They don't, to my knowledge, they don't use it. The AES is ubiquitous throughout our society. AES is not at this time that I know of. They've got AES is one of the most researched algorithms in the world. It's been vetted certainly by our NIST and all our scientists here. And there's one of the theories of cryptography is that you need to publish something openly, and you can make small changes afterwards. For example, you might have a algorithm that says you can't use all zeros, you can't use ones, you can't use the ASCII representation for the word secret as your key. They'll come up with some rules for things like that, but everyone around the world will look at your algorithm and will agree that it's secure. And 5G has gone through that scrutiny, and it's going through even more scrutiny now from people. Oh, who acknowledge and implement validate encryption when designed set for. Oh, I'm all sorts of them. Del Troy, do you see my email? I'll be able to give you a number of people you can talk to when you get done. And what Del Torre is talking about is there's a new. Thank you, Professor Vergers. Thank you. Professor Vergers was my professor when I went to Capitol. Just everyone know he's a master of analog and digital computing. I learned a lot from him. For the FIPS 140-2, the government's trying to better protect information. And Del Troy asked about a government standard FIPS 140-2. There's also 140-3, which is the new version now. And they want to make sure when you protect your personal data, your health data, everything is protected properly. So the government has an office where they check not only for these issues, but several hundred other potential issues. And you can buy For example, if you're going to encrypt your hard disk, Microsoft has what's called a FIPS mode, where if you set your computer properly, it will encrypt the hard drive, and anyone who steals it is going to have a very bad day trying to get the data. If they have lots of liquid nitrogen and other things, they can do it, but the goal is to make it so expensive and fraught with difficulty that they decide to go after somebody else. But Del Toria, thank you. If you'll send an email later, I'll go ahead and send you some research. And Peter, you're welcome, sir.
Okay, let's go back to Arthur's question here. I think it was
Great Creamy Denata.
Okay, let's see. There was a question way up here that Arthur had. Any rough estimate of the percentage of public and social apps that you've come across with this ECB issue?
Hopefully none. The other ones that bother me are I can find what bedroom someone or down at the kitchen table where that is that you're typing things. That was in 2017. They told half the people fix it right away, and the other half told them to get lost. So just search for mobile internet love on YouTube. It just gives you an idea. I haven't found any yet. And Arthur also asked about quantum computing timelines. We believe within 20 years, well, actually within 20 years, AES 128 will be. It may actually be much sooner than that. But their solution was it greatly cut down the time. So you went from AES 128 is not twice as secure as, 256 is not twice as secure. It's to the 128th power more secure than 128. So 256-bit key has to the 128th power more space. That's about 10 to the 70th, which is a really big number. More space where you can for the numbers. So
wow, that is amazing.
Yeah. And
Last call for questions here, and then we'll move on to the end of the webinar. And
sure. And I'm going to a class now, everyone. But so please, if you'll send emails or contact Mr. Gibbs, he'll make sure that that we can answer your questions, and I'd be glad to provide you more information. Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. I appreciate your help, sir.
You bet. Thank you. And let me get back to my screen and see if we can make that. There we go. All right. Again, I want to thank Dr. Hansen. He is incredibly busy. He was telling me before the session started that at this time of the year and everything going on at Capitol that he's been working for some very long hours. So I deeply appreciate the time that he gave. Now, let's talk about next month. As I mentioned, the session that was originally scheduled for today was shoved over exactly 1 month later to March 16th, the occupational safety and health emphasis on mental well-being. Now, this is a completely different departure, of course, from cyber or from encryption, but what Dr. Dillow will be talking about is the fact that out in the workforce, they're discovering that mental issues are huge problems. And we read that in the paper today, people who've shot up their workplace with things like that. But even apart from that, even apart from the very significant, brutal kinds of things, mental health impacts workers in a big way. And it actually is a huge safety issue as well. And he'll be delving into that next month. Or as I mentioned before, today he is down in Brazil. So maybe he'll bring back, for Del Toria or something, he'll bring back some good tidbits from down there. Now let's move on. I started to say food, but I don't think we can send that through digitally. To register for any webinar that we have, and we do actually have webinars scheduled through the rest of the spring. We'll talk about them at another time, but you can go to captechu.edu/webinar-series to learn more about all our webinars and to register. I want to throw this in too. Last night I had the privilege of hosting our monthly Masters Virtual Information System session. And I realized, there may be people out here joining us for the webinars that would like to know that we actually offer virtual information sessions in the same format once a month, on a Sunday for the doctoral and on a Wednesday for the master's. If you're interested in any of that or learning more about that or participating in any way, just send an email to gradadmit@captech.edu and you'll get on that list to be invited to one of those sessions coming up. Now, as we approach the end of the presentation, I wanted to mention that a copy of the slides and a link to the recording will be sent to everybody who registered. Watch for that email. It should come back out later today or in the morning. And also, when you get that email, it will mention the certificate of completion or attendance. If you would like a certificate, just simply respond to that email, and I'll be more than happy to send that to you. It's for a 60-minute webinar. All you need to do is respond to the webinar. Now, with that, I think we are approaching the end. Yeah, that's it. Watch for that follow-up email. And again, I want to thank our presentation presenter today for a very interesting presentation. I'm sorry, got ahead of myself, can't speak. I was reading Luke's comment there. Yeah, security is not just ones and zeros. People are a key component of security. And every time I open the newspaper or read an article on the internet, I realize that we are always the weakness, aren't we? No matter how well others encrypt something, we can open the wrong email, those kinds of things. Now, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. I don't want to yak. I want to go ahead and get us stopped here on time. Look for that email from me, and you all have a great day. And with that, the session, it will end now.